I feel like I always say it's an exciting episode, but the nerd in me is really excited about today because it's full with a lot of rich data. I am joined by Chris Chhim. He is research director with Angus Reid. He knows how Canadians are feeling and have been feeling for quite some time. We're going to dive in there and we're going to talk about the Canadian consumer sentiment, and we're going to talk about value and loyalty with Chris. So thank you so much for coming here today. You're in the
Thank you
hot
for
seat.
inviting me.
No problem. So how long have you been with Angus Reid and what brought you to that world of statistics and research and data?
I just really love numbers, right? But deeper than that, I've been with Angus Reid for about 2 years now. Been in market research and public opinion for a lot longer than that. And really, ultimately, I really like figuring out what makes Canadians do the things they do, right? So sort of it's this larger behavioral question, right? Why do they vote a certain way? Why do they buy a certain thing? Why do they feel a certain way? So it's really just really getting at unraveling those sorts of things, really untangling what makes just people in general tick.
Right. So you have a deep interest in that, but you've also now been helping so many Canadian organizations understand that picture as well. The past 7 years have been a lot.
To say the least, right?
So, yeah, before we dive into all that a lot, just generally, what do you think has been the biggest shift in that time period that you've seen in your research?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say that, it's easy to start with the pandemic as a starting point for sure. And I think that, public sentiment in Canada was going a certain way before the pandemic, but that really marked this point in time where things started to accumulate, right? So we had the pandemic that, I don't need to explain what that was. Everybody went through it. Everybody has their own pandemic trauma and that sort of thing. It disrupted work. It disrupted supply chains. It disrupted a whole bunch of things, right? So our world was completely turned upside down. Then we had inflation. Then we had interest rates going up and down, that sort of thing. And so it's like accumulation of all these factors. And then now we have trade friction with the US as well. So it's a whole bunch of things. Canadians are feeling exhausted, right? I mean, I think I don't need to, state the obvious here.
Yeah.
I think we all feel it. Everyone listening out there feels that, the collective pressure, the collective sort of stress of having to deal with all of these things makes people feel sort of exhausted, right?
Yeah. So exhausting is a great word, very emotional. But if you were to pull it back in terms of actual behaviors, what do you think that this series of never-ending, compounding pressures have done and changed to the Canadian consumers' behaviors?
Yeah. I would say that, this compounding of all these pressures have really trained Canadians to kind of adapt, to really they haven't had really a lot of time to exhale or have a break. So they've learned to adapt to this sort of uncertainty. And I think, when we take a step back and we look at these sorts of larger indicators, everyone pays attention to the rate of inflation, the unemployment rate, this sort of thing. I think, when these things go up and down, we think that, the rate of inflation has declined. That doesn't necessarily erase the price increases that have already happened, right? Like prices are usually going up all the time. They're just going up at a slower rate, right? So that doesn't necessarily erase the fact that prices have, gone up so much since the pandemic. Just because the unemployment rate has gone down or the proportion of Canadians that are currently in work has gone up doesn't necessarily erase the uncertainty that Canadians are facing, right? Just because Canadians are, in employment or they have a job doesn't mean that they're not worried about losing their job or, having some kind of crisis happen that they need to adjust their finances or something like that. So I think, these sorts of things mean that Canadians are still in that sort of like tense mode. Even though some of these larger macroeconomic indicators can come down, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're relaxed yet. I think they're still bracing and waiting for, what's next, right? Yes. We even see now that, our neighbors to the south are threatening to increase tariffs, 50% and that sort of thing. So it's a sort of like, okay, now we have to deal with this as well.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought up our friends to the south. We work very closely with our Rakuten.com counterparts. And one of the things that I'm always communicating is how different Canadian consumers are
Mhm.
to US consumers. And we tend to be more conservative. We tend to react a little quicker, and it takes us longer to feel comfortable. What does your research tell you about Canadians and how they're actually behaving through these micro and macro
Mhm.
storms?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you're right about what you say generally about the difference between consumers in the US, consumers in Canada. Of course, there's a certain regionality to that as well. It's difficult to talk about Canadians in general as consumers.
Mhm.
Quebec is different. The West is different. The Atlantic provinces are certainly different. And the same goes for the US as well, right? To a
Yeah.
certain degree. I would say that given, all the ups and downs that have happened in the past 2 years, I would say that Canadian, we certainly have felt the pressures of the Buy Canadian movement, this sort of thing, this kind of surge of patriotism for sure. And Canadians want to support their local businesses. They want to support Canadian-owned businesses and that sort of thing. But at the same time, they're still dealing with some of that other stuff, right? They're still dealing with the affordability cost, the pressures of having to manage your household finances when everything is more expensive, when you have to constantly have in the back of your head, there could be something, that I could lose my job. The roof could need to be repaired, that sort of thing. So I think that we're seeing a lot of Canadians, have that intent of, I want to support local, I want to do this, but it's a trade-off, right? So it's this sort of introduced this economy of trade-off. So what exactly are brands or what exactly are companies asking their consumers to trade off, and is it actually worth it? So, it might be worth supporting Canadian. It might be worth buying those Canadian strawberries, right?
Yeah.
And I think this also varies by category, right? A small purchase, maybe a one-time thing. You want to buy a gift for a friend, buying local, supporting a local artisan, that's great. But things that you buy on a regular basis, or things that, where there's a huge gap, I think this is where you start to get those trade-offs, right? Yeah, well, I really do want to support local, but also, I have all these other obligations that I have to meet as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the strawberries. That was such a big deal. There was strawberries for $2 and then
Hmm.
Canadian strawberries for $6 to $8. Those $2 strawberries were rotting.
Yeah.
And it was a weird sense of pride for a lot of Canadians
Hmm.
to have that. But it's easier to make that decision with a $6 to $8 purchase
Hmm.
versus now there's a difference of a couple $1,000s.
Yeah.
So from a category perspective, how do those trade-offs look different when you're talking about a lower average spend versus a larger spend? Are there still trade-offs happening on both sides, and what are those trade-offs?
Oh, there are definitely there are trade-offs all around, right?
Okay.
So, as I was saying earlier, it's really, maybe that one-off spend, you really want to, impress, a friend with a really nice gift. You might want to, these kind of one-off things. I think people are more willing to make that purchase. It's really when those sort of differences accumulate over time. To go back to the strawberry story, I was just actually talking with one of my friends about how kids eat a lot of strawberry, or like berries
Yes.
nowadays. This
Yeah.
is like a huge thing, that they just go through like baskets and baskets of berries. So think about those, $2 strawberries versus the $6, Ontario or Quebec strawberries, right? If your kids are, eating them, all the time, you might start to make different decisions for sure.
Yeah, I started growing my own 10 years ago. I'm saving hundreds a year, at least in the summertime. Um, everyone talks about value,
Hmm.
and these trade-offs and these conditions kind of hint to this idea that maybe consumers are challenging brands when it comes to value and loyalty, and that loyalty could become pretty loose on a brand when there's a trade-off or a value that is putting pressure there. Have you seen loyalty weaken in any specific sector or segment or area of Canada, and where value is driving that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think with all these pressures accumulating, um, I wouldn't say that loyalty is dead per se, but it certainly needs to justify itself. And this is definitely a context where consumers are experimental. They're getting, you know, they're coming around to at least trying different brands.
Mhm.
Maybe switch is a strong word. We definitely have data that say that over, half of consumers in the past 3 months have switched brands, right? They've decided that they need to trade off in other areas of their lives. So maybe, they use a different brand of toilet paper, or
Yeah.
maybe they don't go for the Ontario strawberries and this sort of thing. But, that's kind of the doorway, right? So that kind of leads to the discovery. And then, we have other data that says that, I think it's something around like 40%, upwards of 40% of consumers actually find that the new brand that they've tried, they don't really notice, that much of a tangible difference, and will stick with that. And you
Yeah.
do have people saying that, there is a brand now that, they'll consider buying in the future. So I think that loyalty is not necessarily dead. I think loyalty just needs to be justified more and more on a purchase by purchase basis. I think it needs to be earned each
Yes.
time. I think brands can't simply rely on kind of, I don't want to say blind loyalty. They can't
Yep.
rely on habits, I would say, because like I said, it's about trade-offs. So that these decisions going on in consumers' heads every single day.
Yeah, I think that's most noticeable on the ketchup wars. So Canadian-made
Yes.
ketchup. If there's not a documentary on that, I feel like there's going to be a documentary on ketchup. But I think with where we're going, I want to come back and talk to you in a year about switching brands.
Yeah.
Because thinking about the grocery store, when I go there now, half of the products are different. And I think it's a little bit of the trade options that are opening up in Canada and partnering with different countries and the products that are coming in. How are Canadians, what's their sentiment on new products kind of coming into the market? Do we have a read on that yet?
We're starting to get some reads about how Canadians are responding to these new products. I think, one of your previous guests was talking about how one of the most stressful things that you can do in a new country is go grocery shopping.
Yes, yes.
And, it's definitely that, right? Like Canadians are open to exploring, right? So they do have brands that they like, right? But when, your pocketbook is under pressure, you might be open to trying that different brand of cereal, that different brand of mustard or whatever, and that sort of thing. So Canadians are largely, experimental, I would say, but they just haven't been given the opportunity to be so, right? So now with these new products, we have, partnerships with other countries, coming in. I think that they're starting to discover different brands, and I think that could be potentially trouble. I don't want to say trouble. That could be challenging for established brands here in Canada, for sure.
Yes. Okay. More pressure on established brands.
More pressure on established brands, and I think that large players, established brands in the Canadian market, I would probably advise them to not rely on sort of some of the traditional levers, which have been habit, nostalgia, Canadiana, this sort of thing. Canadiana, is certainly a thing to play on, but it needs to come into play with other factors, right? So it's
Yes.
sort of, not the main driver, but I would say that it's certainly a one-up, right? It's certainly a plus. So everything given equal, the Canadian brand will always win. Given a huge price difference, maybe they might choose the Canadian brand for a one-off purchase or for a special occasion. For things that you buy every single day or, more frequently, I would say just relying on that Canadian, credential, it needs to be partnered with value. It needs to be partnered with convenience. It needs to be partnered with, these other aspects of value that you talk about.
Well said. My brain's going in this conversation was the privilege that we have at Rakuten, having so many different stores and different categories. In real time, we see how consumer spending is shifting. But again, we are isolated to 750 stores, and some categories have different weight. What have you seen as the single biggest change in consumer behavior over the past, say, year? Is it a specific category or a specific spending habit, less frequency? Like, what's the biggest change that the data speaks to this year?
I would say that, one of the biggest things is that you get a lot more Canadians that are open to bargain hunting, right? So, they're on the lookout for deals. And, there is a certain percentage of people that get that rush out of getting that huge deal. You have, I would say about a quarter of Canadians saying that they really love hunting down deals, right? And it's easy to think that, oh, Canadians just love deals, but there is still that other rest of that pie, right? So the
Right.
other proportion of people, you have a fair amount of people saying that they're looking for deals because they have to, right? So
Right.
because of some of those pressures that we were talking about earlier, you also have a certain amount of people that say that they get a rush out
Okay.
of, out of getting a good deal. They feel like they've won, right?
Yes.
So I think, you know, given all the things that have happened, you're getting a Canadian consumer that feels like they've won when they get a deal. I would also link that back to maybe a sense of, control almost. So it's a way
Okay.
of, all these things that are, happening in the world and that have been going on for the past few years.
Yeah.
This is a way that Canadians can say, okay, this is, you know, that I can demonstrate control and also competence, right? So it's
Right.
like, I understand how the system works. I know that I can get these deals. I know I can get a lower price if I do X, Y, or Z thing. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that's coming out in the past few years.
I can confirm that because we see that in the space. We see members joining Bracketon and being more engaged and
Hmm.
doing the hard work and using the coupons and the deals and subscribing to the email. So we've seen that behavior
Hmm.
as well, that taking over control
Hmm.
where I can,
Hmm.
which maybe is our prime minister for saying control what we can control. It's trickling down into our shopping behaviors. But say 5, 7, 8 years ago, deal hunting, what was that like for Canadians compared to today, where it is a necessity and a thrill and a control aspect? Were they deal hunting 8 years ago?
I think they were, but I think it definitely took a different shape. And maybe nowadays there's more urgency around needing to look for a deal. The other thing is that I would say that people are willing, back in the day, people were willing to root around a little bit more. They're willing to maybe jump through a few more hoops.
Okay.
Nowadays, I would say that, yes, sure, there are those people that do love, the bargain hunting. They do love hunting things down, that sort of thing. But because of the accumulation of everything that we have to carry around in our heads, right? Like
Yes.
what's going on in my own life? Am I in danger of losing my job? Like, what about my children? What about my mortgage? This sort of thing. We're carrying around so many more things in our heads nowadays, just also as a byproduct of modern society progressing in the past decade or
Yeah.
so, that I would say they're also looking for simplicity as well,
Okay.
right? So, uh, getting these deals in an easy way. And I don't want to say easy way. Getting these deals
Less
without
friction.
with less friction. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Because that's the thing. And, in that same data where we had, about a quarter saying that they love hunting down deals, there are, other percentages like upwards of, 30% saying, yeah, I like a deal if I don't have to work too hard to get it and that sort of thing. So that's probably where Rakuten kind of steps in as well, right? It's just sort
Yeah.
of because it's kind of housed under one roof, it makes finding these deals and getting the rewards much easier, right? You don't have to do a lot of complex calculations because they're already carrying around so much stuff in their heads.
Thank you. You're hired. You're hired. We do aim for simplicity because we see how important it is in the consumer's journey. And you're absolutely right about what we're carrying in our headspace. That can lead consumers to being more thoughtful in how they're spending and where they're finding deals. Could it also go the opposite direction where it's driving more impulse? And, I'm starting to think about revenge spending
Mhm.
and things like that. Like, what switches that behavior, or are they really separate behaviors, two different types of people?
I
Do
will.
we know? Do we know?
I think it's possible to, carry many different personalities in the same person. So definitely, the same person that, is very conscientious, very good at, finding deals and that sort of thing. Maybe that psychologically gives a little space for that revenge spend, that revenge travel to go out to come out from time to time, right? So I think,
Yeah.
it's very possible both of those things can be true, is what I'll say.
Okay, I love it. And I might have a couple of different personalities, so I will agree with that as well. I was going to ask you, how are Canadians feeling today?
Mhm.
But that might be very different today than it was yesterday, given the 50%
Mhm.
tariff conversations that have been happening. But leading up so far in 2026, how are Canadian consumers feeling today?
They're very cautious. I would say they're cautiously going about their day, right? I wouldn't say optimistic, because we do have data that shows that quite a fair percentage of Canadians think that things could potentially get worse a year from now. I think there's but I think there's a large percentage of people saying that things will pretty much stay the same. So I think they're cautious. They're waiting, maybe on edge, for the next big thing that may rock their lives. So hence why they've started to adjust their spending accordingly, right? So I'd say they're nervous.
Within that spend adjustment, where's savings coming into this? Are Canadians saving more? Are they spending less but being smarter with, and like, what's that picture look like?
Yeah, I would say that, Canadians overall, so there's a fair amount of people experiencing financial distress, I would say. I think some of our latest opinion shows that maybe about 30% either cannot meet their monthly, obligations, like the bills that they have to pay, or actively have to go into debt to meet them. There is another, cushion, let's say another layer of people that say that they can, meet all their obligations, they can pay all their bills, but they really don't have much left over. And then there's another layer, about another third of people that say that, they can meet their obligations and still have a little bit of money left over. So I think that, they are the ones who are saving, but they're keeping it, right? They're not spending it. They're keeping it for that next big crisis. They're keeping it for a rainy day, that sort of thing.
So based on that, you're making me question how Canadians are saving today. And we've got three quadrants: more economic pressures. You would think automatically that we're saving less, but the data might tell a different picture. How is this all changing how Canadians are saving, and are we saving more now?
That's a big question. I would say that Canadians probably are more intent. They have the intention of saving more than, let's say, 10 years ago, because of all these different pressures and all these different, stressors that are accumulating in their lives. Things are getting more expensive. Mortgage rates, are up and down, that sort of thing. So they definitely have the intention, but because of all those other things that I mentioned that are stressing them, they find themselves not being able to save as much.
Right.
That's what I would say to that.
You make me think of the Great Depression and the way generations behaved. There's fundamental behavior shifts in those that lived through the Depression and the generations that came after, and they're still present today, 60 years later.
Yeah.
Based on what we've gone through in 7 years, do you think there will be a generation or a subgroup of people who think about saving differently?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think, needless to say, the pandemic was huge, right? And everything that we've gone through, all these once in a lifetime events that certain generations have gone through, and they're sort of more foundational years, will definitely affect them for the rest of their lives, pretty much. We often talk about in economics about wage scarring, for instance, and that sort of thing. So the fact that, they've been underemployed, or have maybe not had pay rises, or have had more precarious employment, kind of sets you on a certain trajectory, right? As opposed to if you had those, positive growth opportunities, you're able to jump around to different jobs and increase your salary and that sort of thing. So I think wage scarring, also the way that people talk about money differently as well. So we've done a whole bunch of other studies talking about sort of the way people feel about their finances. And, because of these pressures, we're seeing that younger generations, there's a certain openness to talk about finances. There's an openness to talk about whether or not they can afford things, right? I think there's less of the keeping up with the Joneses mentality. And in fact, it's sort of not shameful, or, people are just talking about their financial struggles a little bit more in the open, possibly because a lot of people are going through the same thing. So it's maybe cathartic. It's maybe like a group therapy kind of thing as well, just to admit to these sorts of things that maybe previous generations, maybe it was a bit taboo to talk about money in the open and that sort of thing. There's certainly more openness in this generation, for sure.
You said the word shame, and we had a guest on Stacked, Danica Nelson, and we really talked about living a life of freedom. And people would spend on a lifestyle that they don't actually want because they want to be perceived as they have more money, they're wealthier. That's kind of going wayside. And even there's the quiet luxury movement where there's no logos, there's no labels. And so you're really speaking to, I think, I think a really healthy shift in consumers moving away from that feeling of shame, of that competition, which I think will be healthier overall. Talking about, that keeping up with the Joneses and looking like we're rich makes me think of the luxury category. We're in a K economy. There's certain sectors that are getting hurt, but what's the luxury category look like? How are consumers within that space reacting right now?
I mean, I would say that it's very tempting when we talk about these macroeconomic indicators and, how much financial stress Canadians are under. It's very tempting to think that Canadians are just looking for the lowest cost, right?
Right.
And to a certain degree, that is true in some sectors and for some people. Um, However, I mean, I would say that Canadians are more intentional about the things that they want to buy, right? So there is, luxury isn't dead for sure. I mean, people would still want nice things for themselves and that sort of thing. But it has to be justified, right? People will not just spend thousands of dollars on a shirt or a bag just because, right? So it's what am I getting out of this? And, that looks like different things to different people. So what is the utility that you're getting out of this purchase, right? So maybe for some people it is, I want to look, great and
Yeah.
wonderful and rich and that sort of thing. And that's the utility that they get out of it, right? That's the value that they get out of that money. For others, it might be, oh, it's higher quality materials, that sort of thing. And they care about that sort of thing. So there is value in that sort of thing as well. So I would say that, luxury brands shouldn't, be panicking at this point in time, but really think about, what is driving these consumers? Like what is the value that they're getting out of these products and really, lean into that.
Okay, that's a fantastic answer, and not at all what I would have assumed in terms of that intentionality. So thank you for that. The landscape across the board, different categories. Is there one in particular that you think could use more data about consumer spending in terms of they're being hit the hardest in shifts, or it's happening faster, or data is really going to help them maintain the storm?
Can I say all of them?
Yes, you can.
I mean, I'm probably biased
Mhm.
given, where I work and that sort of thing. But we always say that more data is helpful, right? It always hurts. It can't hurt to have more data about these sorts of things. And you of course risk being overwhelmed by all the information and trying to make sense of the noise. But it certainly help you make decisions for sure, right?
Okay. Given you have insights and so much data, what is one nugget you can give to brands who are not necessarily using data enough in these times? What are they missing? What's one piece of information you think they should all hear today in terms of how to weather the storms?
I would say and it's a buzzword nowadays, but I would say that one of the huge things that brands need to be paying attention to is the role of AI in the shopping process, in the search process. It was a time when people would shop around, they would go to different sites and this sort of thing. And it's a small percent for now, but I think has the potential to grow. Is that the number of people that are maybe inputting some of their preferences into their favorite AI tool and say, okay, I need a new face wash, or I need, I want to plan a holiday package and this sort of thing, or I want to purchase a car even. And to say, given all these things, what are some models, what are some brands, what are some products that I should be thinking about? And then trying to figure out how your brand shows up in those search results, right? So I think this is one of the things. It's like the new SEO kind of thing,
Yes.
right? So how to optimize how your company, how your brand shows up in AI. And I think this is also tied to this larger question about cognitive load, right? So
Yeah.
because of going back to that idea about we have so many things in our heads, we're carrying them around. You really want to simplify the process for people, right? So I know that we tend to think of, value, convenience, access, like there are different indicators, right? That,
Yes.
us on the inside, we like to, have them all separated out, but, consumers experience them all together, right? So I think it's about reducing that burden that people have to think about. There's so many things that they have to consider, and to think about, sort of how if you have a loyalty or rewards program, like how that is maybe helping or hindering the thought process, right? Because, you do have certain programs where it's difficult to redeem. Like you were thinking about, you have to activate certain offers, and
Yeah.
there's certain multipliers on certain days, and this and that, and you can only use these things for this certain thing. To think about all the things that we have to worry about in the world. And then remember, I need to do my, shampoo purchase on this particular day because I get 10 times the points. That only appeals to a certain percentage of people, right? So I think, reducing the cognitive burden that you're placing on your customers is a huge thing. And then that ties into that bigger AI sort of like search engine.
Yeah, it's almost removing that cognitive load and narrowing things down, and then brands have to be very careful about bringing that load back.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying? Is that accurate? How they're playing together? Do you think?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will agree on the SEO side and how that's changing amongst AI. It's a huge topic right now. And I think there's a lot of brands who are going to miss the memos or going to underestimate or underscore the importance of doing that now because, if anyone's in there, it knows it takes time to build. It takes time to optimize and mature. So I think that's a great tip from a brand side to make sure you're leaning in there.
And I would say it works two ways, right? So the brands need to be conscious about how they're showing up in these sorts of AI tools that are, I feel like their usage will only increase, but also people using them to be cognizant of, where's this information coming from? Am I checking it? That sort of thing. So it does work both ways.
It does. You're making me think, and we've had different episodes talking about simplicity and how important it is in a loyalty program and how AI is changing the consumer journey and making it so fast and efficient. Now it's almost making me think that load, that cognizant load is going from the consumers onto us working in the space, because now we have to think about how we're showing up, and we're racing with AI to keep up with it, and we're understanding value of our consumers and where we're showing up. And so it's been almost this huge shift, is it fair to say, onto marketers?
I'm not sure if it's a shift per se in terms of the burden going from the consumer to the brand, but I would say that they just have different things to worry about.
Okay.
So I think we have this new tool that we're only just starting to get at the tip of the iceberg as to what it can do and what it does. So I think it's two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah. No. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. That's a much better way to think through it. So thank you.
No problem.
Now you're leading me to my favorite questions, which is about value. And I get to ask you not only what your personal definition of value is, but what you think Canadians as a whole, their definition of value is. So let's start with you, Chris. How do you personally define value? What does it mean to you?
I've had a lot of thoughts about this, not just, after being invited here, but also just in general, right? Because of all the stuff going on. I would say for me, value is less friction, right? I find myself willing to pay a little bit more if it simplify things in my life. If, I don't have to wait in line somewhere or, this sort of thing. If it's taking away a stressor or a worry, that sort of thing, I think for me, that's worth it in a sense.
Okay.
To switch gears and to think about what value means for Canadians. And once again, it goes back to this idea that everybody is different. Canadians are different by region, age, gender, this sort of thing. So really everybody has their own, kind of set of values and the utility that they derive out of things. So I think if I were to give like a general piece of advice about what value means for Canadians, I think it means, being confident that you've made the right choice, right? So I think it's, based on what you think is important, what you are willing to pay more for, what you want to get out of a certain experience or product, having that idea that you're protected against not having made the wrong decision, right? So I think that, this comfort of knowing that you've made the right choice. And it also sort of like goes back to some of those thoughts about being in control and feeling empowered and feeling like you've made the smart choice. I think that's what I would say value would probably mean to Canadians in general.
That really resonated with me. So I feel like that's a great way to describe value for Canadians as a whole. Obviously, we're all unique. And as we've learned, every definition of value so far has been different. And so we can't just blanket the definition of value to Canadians, but it does resonate that we are more conservative, more thoughtful, and we do pride ourselves on those good decisions. Chris, thank you for being here. I will say to anyone watching, data and having third parties bring you data outside of your world and what you can gather and hone in on is going to be more critical and exceptionally valuable, because we've gone through the gamut for the past 6 years. It's not going to slow down. There's more ahead of us. And the consumer behaviors and how they're responding are changing every day, every week. Like I said, today, very different from yesterday based on headlines. So please find friends with data. I can recommend some here from Angus Reid, but it is evolving. It's heavy, it is crazy. It is a fun world within the consumer space. And I'm glad to have Angus Reid help us navigate that.
No problem. And to that point, I would also add that, understanding the overall context is also invaluable, right? Because consumers don't necessarily operate in a vacuum. So they really need to take into account the whole context of what's going on in the world and how it affects how people are feeling and ultimately how they're spending.
That a perfect comment to help us with our load, our mental load, and being very focused on what's important and what's not important, because everything's coming at us everywhere, every day, all at once. Thank you. Thank you for that context.
No problem.
Okay, there you have it.
And that's it for this episode of Stacked. If you found this useful, follow along as we interview leaders shaping the future of retail and learn how value really works behind the scenes. And if there's a topic you want us to unpack, I'd love to hear from you. See you next time.